Hello, it's March the 23rd. It's time for THCB Gang. I'm Matthew Holt, the healthcare blogs publisher, founder, guy who does all the work and nothing else, and a bunch of other stuff. And I have fine lineup today. I'm still having if you're watching on the video, this weird thing where Zoom is flickering me in and out of my max headroom, but if you're listening on the podcast, you don't care. I have Ian Morrison, health futurist, Kim Bellard, writer, regular THC contributor, who's been blowing up a storm this week, and John Neptune from Suntra Modern Recovery and the Is It Serious podcast, joining me today. Sadly, we lost Jen Goldsack right at the last minute here, so our aggressive digital health loving English rower is not here. She will be here next week, though, for those who are on. All right, so gents, great to see you all. It's been, more craziness. I'm still waiting around for the, my wife tells me that she's been telling my son, who is now 8, but since he was 2, she's been telling him that she's looking forward to, she's listening to the news in order to hear Donald Trump is being fired or arrested. Initially, my son thought that meant Donald Trump was going to be set on fire, which who knows may happen. And we thought he was going to be arrested this week, or he thought he was going to be arrested, apparently, and hasn't happened quite yet. So who the hell knows? But will be an interesting week. First US president ever to be arrested at some point. May happen between now and then. It's your local district attorney, JL, who's doing the... Actually, you're in probably the northern part of Manhattan. I don't know if he's in the right part of Manhattan to arrest.
No, there's only one Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg. There's
there's only one. I thought it was like a southern district and northern district, or was that federal?
Well, I think that's the federal. I think there's like a southern district and I don't know the other district, but there's only one Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg.
All right, well, he's on the way. All right, fantastic. Well, let's now that part of the news may not be do much to healthcare. So why don't we talk about what has gone on in healthcare? Kim, why don't I start with you?
So I try not to pay much attention to television commercials, but I started noticing this one commercial that was running over and over again. It was aimed at our local Democratic congressman, claiming that President Biden is pushing for billions of dollars of Medicare cuts, cutting services to lots of millions of senior citizens. And then I slowly realized that it's her Medicare Advantage. And not since the Harry and Louise days, which some of you may remember the reference to, have they tried to portray the insurance companies as the victims. And I'm just sort of astounded. The New York Times had an article yesterday that apparently this is all related to some rules that Biden is trying to push through to get at some of the overbilling for Medicare Advantage plans and so on. But now they're the big victims, and they have enough market share that people care about it and are starting to get alarmed by these ads about cutting their keep your hands off my health insurance and don't touch my Medicare Advantage at that either. As a member of traditional Medicare, I think I kind of resent that, because I think those dollars that they're getting are dollars that are not going to me. So, it's just sort of interesting to watch how the wheel is returned.
Well, Kim, the obvious solution is you sign up for Medicare Advantage just at the moment they're about to cut all those benefits.
Well, it's actually, I saw a quote in the article about that. So some of it goes to there are some conditions, vascular disease and depression and so on, where the rates that the Medicare Advantage plans say is true in their membership is like 3, 4, 10 times in the population. And so the Medicare officials say, well, that's obviously they're overusing these diagnoses. And they're like, no, that just shows that we're doing a better job of identifying people. So the devil depends on the point of view that you're taking.
Absolutely. There was a Kaiser Family Foundation debate on this between Richard Cronick and a guy from Avalier who's never blanking on. And it got a little feisty. I watched about half of it, but it's still... and I ended up in a Slack conversation with the guy this morning about this, who was saying again, that the plans are overcharging, and I'm still of the belief that the plans are indeed overcharging, but their average cost is actually still lower than Medicare fee-for-service. But one of the things that came out this morning was whether or not the Medicare Advantage plans were keeping people with kidney disease on dialysis, or whether they were shoving them back into the general population. And there is so much discussion and so little precision about the costs of Medicare Advantage, the outcomes, the quality, and all the rest of it. There's also a separate conversation, which I haven't yet to publish yet, but I've been in with a guy who ended up with his mum in a SNF. And I think it ended up with you, and there was a bit of back and forth on his talk about this. And I have actually got a connection with I've got articles. I've got the pieces, I haven't put the article together yet, about whether denial of care in a sniff, was a what was going on, and whether it's good or bad for the patient, whether it's saving money, etc. And there was a question as to how much market share coming into the sniff came from that Medicare Advantage plan, and therefore whether the sniff would actually protect the interest, quote unquote, of its patient versus United or the UPMC health plan, whoever it was. So I mean, we're going to dig a lot more into this, but I would love somebody who I can actually trust to explain to me this, because the people are so far apart on how much different. If you talk to the folks from the Medicare Advantage side, or even the community health plans that Community Health Plan Association, their view of how much it costs versus what MedPAC says is just these numbers are just don't even make sense. Anyway, I'll shut up. JL.
I have been very interested in the last couple of weeks in the explosion of digital health interest in GLP-1 agonists. So this new class of weight loss drugs, Ozempic, Rybelsus, and Wegovy. You probably saw maybe a week and a half ago, Weight Watchers announced that they had acquired Sequence Health, which is a digital health company that was offering at-home delivery of Ozempic. Ro has seen that their weight loss division is becoming like their #1 vertical. And these drugs, which are unbelievably effective at helping people lose weight, 10, 20% weight loss in a relatively short period of time, are now being plugged into this hyper heated up engine, which is digital health companies that are looking for growth. So I think that's a very interesting space. You're going to see a lot more around weight loss. And Kim, you made a reference to, for those of us who can remember, I can remember the fen days when I was young, just starting as a doctor. And I'm hoping that the GLP-1 agonists do not turn out to be the next fen. But it's a huge space, and we're actually seeing a problem in the sense that the drugs are being developed for diabetics, but are being diverted now to people who are seeking weight loss and seeking weight loss, recreational weight loss, often not even medically indicated weight loss. So I think that that's a very important issue, and something that we'll be hearing a lot more in the near term.
Yeah, I'd love to come back and talk about that. There's a lot going on in that world. Not the least, was it Jimmy Fallon hosted the Oscars, and he looked at the room and went, in this room,
Jimmy Kimmel.
Ozempic might be right for me. Well, he allegedly was on the 5-2 diet, which I was on for a while. The last time I was not fat, I did the 5-2 diet, which worked for a while, but then faded. So, Ian, we can discuss weight loss diets, golf swings, whatever you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important topic. And our good friend Raj Agarwal, I saw him a couple of weeks ago. He's got a new venture doing this sort of multimodal obesity treatment startup, which
did he put his hand in your wallet? Did he put his hand in your wallet and get some investment out of you for it? Yeah. I'm sure he was trying.
Yeah, so maybe connect that issue to the one Kim raised. Just over the last 24 hours, the stories that came together. One was this MA squeeze that we talked that Kim raised, which I think is interesting. The other related, maybe not directly related, but the North Carolina basically got Medicaid expansion over the line, and the governor will sign it. Apparently, he's got to present a state budget before it will actually be enacted. But presumably, if you can negotiate that, that probably knocks covers about 600,000 people. So it really is only, I just looked it up, Florida, Texas, and Georgia, big states that haven't expanded Medicaid. There's the Confederacy who are still, not moving, Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera. But that's about 10 million of the uninsured right there, just in Florida, Texas, and Georgia. So anyway, and there is a point here that they are connected. And then the third piece that happened yesterday was the first meeting of the California Healthcare Affordability Board, which has been appointed, and this is the kind of emulation of Stu Altman's thing in Massachusetts, except that it is a law with teeth, that there are penalties. Now I won't bore you with my sort of summary reading of the timeline, and I've been sort of exposed to it by presentations of the California Hospital Association, but it basically doesn't have teeth until 2028, when they actually could have penalties. But the point of all of this is public payers squeezed, right? And private payers will get squeezed by this affordability thing. The net result will be ever increasing focus on the cost shift. And so I think the big questions, apart from the technology future, are what's the future of Medicaid financing? Never mind Medicare, Medicaid financing, and the one that we've been on about for a while, which is, just how long are employers going to tolerate being the fall guy financially?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot in what you said, but obviously the future of the uninsured, right, and the future of the ACA and the future of Medicaid expansion is a big deal. And how, and given the relative politics of those states, Florida in particular, which used to be a swing state, becoming more and more, more and more to the DeSantis land, and going after, I forget, it used to be that they were one time, Jen's not here to defend her home state, but at one time recently, they were both going to ask girls to track their periods, and now they can't talk about it. How they got there, I don't know, but they don't seem to be focused on, the bread and butter issues. I'm thinking of they're burning books rather than figuring out how to get people insurance.
Yeah, the other crazy story this morning at Twitter I saw was Florida is trying to pass a bill to prevent anyone from looking at DeSantis's travel records. I mean,
maybe he went on over to Epstein's Island with Trump and Bill Gates. God knows what
does it say about the GOP that 3 of the governors who might be presidential candidates, DeSantis, Kemp, and Abbott, are all 3 governors of states that haven't expanded Medicaid and don't care about the people, and did a terrible job in COVID. So evidently they just don't care about healthcare for poor people.
Well, Trump actually pointed out that DeSantis did a terrible job in COVID in one of his rants, which was quite interesting, I thought. But I mean, but there are people who tell you that, well, it wasn't that bad, and Florida stayed open and business did better there because they stayed open. And we don't want to get back into that COVID argument we've been having for the last 3 years, but you can go back and forth. But it does seem to me that it's remarkable how in some of the swing states, when you get like North Carolina finally gets a Democratic governor, and they can finally get this over the line, because and on the healthcare side, the delivery side knows that lack of Medicaid expansion has been bloody awful for the rural hospitals and the business of healthcare in that state, let alone what for the actual people. So
I don't track it as well as some people, but I'm not aware of any state referendum where the voters actually voted on it that has failed. Every time it's gotten to the referendum stage, I think it's passed.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right, Kim. And I've seen some private polling in the past where, in every state, in every non-holdout state, that this group did some private polling, and they found a majority of people would vote for it in just about every state.
And Matthew, a question for you. I mean, the feeling that I've always had is that the medical lobby or the healthcare lobby in most states is quite powerful, right? I mean, what do you think is the explanation for why those states that you mentioned have not expanded Medicaid? Is that just a stance on not expanding government? I mean, is that a philosophical thing? Or?
I think Michael Millicent wrote a lot about this on THCB and elsewhere back around the time of the ACA passage, and he was not particularly unblunt about it. A lot of this was in why would people in these states not vote for pro ACA? I think even one was in Kentucky, which did have a Democratic governor at the time, and so it did have an exchange and went into the ACA and did Medicaid. Did it do Medicaid expansion? Yeah. Did Medicaid expansion, right? And there was a whole bunch of analysis that he did, and some other people. I think Jonathan Cohn wrote about a bunch of people who ended up voting, even though they were working in enrolling people in key care. I think was it key care or K care or whatever that local thing was called. It wasn't anything to do with Obama, even though it was the exchange, and those people all ended up voting for Trump anyway. And a lot of this is it gets lost in the bigger identity politics. And a lot of and Michael will tell you, if Michael Wilson was on, he would say, well, it's because lot of those working class white people don't want to vote for somebody they think is benefiting that, those other people who don't look like them, who are who may have less money. But I think you're right. I think it's similar to like abortion, right? So you get when the whole thing gets tied up. If you look at where the states, even was it Nebraska, ran an abortion ballot measure? Was it Nebraska? Kansas, right? Where I'm sure if you look at who's in government across it, it's a bunch of people who are massively opposed to abortion history, but actually, voted in favor of on a pro-abortion measure. I think there's a lot of it that you don't get these individual issues splitting off, and when you do split it off, it doesn't work. But if you look at the politics and the polling of all of this stuff, if you look at almost any quote unquote Democratic versus Republican position on issues of society and business and politics and healthcare and whatever, they're usually favored by 55% of the people wherever they, plus wherever they are. And yet when it comes down to it, half through that state will vote for Trump or whomever over Clinton, or or Romney over Obama, or even Trump over Biden, well, just because.
Here's another funny ad that I've been noticing. So we are apparently in Ohio. Apparently, there's a proposal to put an abortion rights amendment on the ballot this fall, and they're already doing ads against it. And they show these pictures of these young girls saying, your daughter might need, decide to get an abortion. They may pressure her into getting an abortion or to become a transgender person or whatever. And this amendment would explicitly prohibit the state from getting involved in that. I'm thinking like, wait, your argument is you want the state to get involved in the care of your children's health care? I mean, that's really your argument? They're presenting it as a parent's right, but what they don't want is the state to be prohibited. It's like, I think you don't want to open that door unless you're really careful about what's going to come in. It's
like 4D reverse psychology,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, this is it all goes back to my amateur political science days from 35 years ago. It all goes back to, can you distract people off the core of what's actually going on? And obviously you have these ideological battles, and people get if you look at the amount of people who come into contact with either a transgender person or a drag show is a square root of 0, right? And yet I think in Utah at one point they had some legislation which I think got vetoed by the governor, opposing transgender kids taking part in the other genders, the ACAB gender or AFAB or ACAB, whatever they call it, gender. Sport in sports, and it turned out there was one individual transgender girl, I think, or boy, whatever, one in the whole state. Who this would refer to. And so, these sort of ideological rallying cries. To me, they're just, I would say, as a good Marxist, they're just distraction from the real class struggle. And
here's another good example. So, Wyoming passed a ban on abortions. And one of their appeals courts heard it, and apparently the argument that the legislators made is that abortion is not healthcare. And the judge said, well, wait a minute, it has to be done by a licensed medical professional in a licensed place, or get an FDA approved drug prescribed by a doctor. You're saying that's not healthcare? And the state's lawyer was like, well, if you look at it from the point of view of the mother, it's healthcare. But if you look at it from the standpoint of the unborn fetus, it's not healthcare. She's like, okay, that's the argument.
Well, that's obviously been the overriding massive ideological issue that's been a big drama behind changes in the Republican Party and changes in society, and one of the things, it was part of the deal. If you talk to, if you think about what Sheldon Whitehouse has been talking about, the senator from Rhode Island, the Federalist Society basically concocted a deal where they got these social issues, and support for them in the Republican Party onto the Supreme Court. So that in general now, so you get the Dobbs ruling and you get this other ruling, and hidden behind that is a bunch of other rulings that are very favorable to the Koch brothers and others, around voting turns out, environmental laws and this, that, and the other. And that's where we're going to end up. And we don't know the result yet of the what we talked about the last couple of weeks, which is the Texas ruling on mifepristone, the abortifacient. But this stuff, I see it continues on. This is very, very strong theme in American politics. And what's worse is I think we're exporting it to other countries, but which used to be sensible. It used to be battles between, the bourgeois and the proletariat. And now this kind of urban, rural, religious, ideological stuff is coming into politics elsewhere. But it's certainly, it's, if you look at, I would go back to the whole DeSantis thing we talked about, there ain't much else there, right? I mean, the old yes, I think McCarthy's saying something about balancing the budget or whatever now, but I mean, really, there's very little of that there in their politics, and we're going to have to deal. I hope you're all ready for next year when we're going to have to deal with Trump and DeSantis and whomever going after each other in these these Republican debates. It's going to be who can be more pure on these incredibly crazy issues. Anyway,
but I think that explains perfectly. It's what Kim said earlier about the cultural divide and the governors who are on the team of hang Fauci or whatever it is they're on about these days. But I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. It's a few years old now, but I was working with the Tennessee Hospital Association. They're at a board meeting, and their number one priority was Medicaid expansion. And their lobbyists came back after lunch and said, well, that's a bad idea because the Koch brothers have just said they're going to primary any single legislator who votes for it so that they will not get reelected. And, a lot of the reason why this stuff didn't go through, despite public opinion in favor of it, is just the state legislatures are so often so gerrymandered to have control, maximal control by Republicans. And it's part of this ideological war that's going on in the country. And I agree with you; it's going to get worse. But
yeah, I mean, the other one that's fascinating here is I think there's now been like 2 states where when you put recreational marijuana on the ballot, it hasn't worked. It just didn't. It just failed in Oklahoma. I think it's Oklahoma, which had
Oklahoma, yeah.
I think apparently has more medical marijuana per head, or dispensaries per head than any other state, including California. But if you go to the vast swaths of America, including all the West Coast and New York and a bunch of other places, I think it's almost a trivial non-issue now, and it's somewhat similar to gay marriage, right? It was this massive thing. And once it actually passed in that case nationwide, by the Supreme Court, believe it or not, which clearly would never do it again in its current state, it just isn't that once you take it out of the battle and say this thing is done either state-based or elsewhere, that it seems to me it doesn't. It really doesn't. These things don't matter that much in the way that everyday society runs, and don't impact that many people. Unless, of course, you're one of the people who invested in a massive, marijuana farm in California and found that apparently prices have collapsed. But as they hear about marijuana, is that now the price is so much higher in the UK than it is in California. People are now drug muling, drug muling from Los Angeles, massive suitcases full of
reverse muling
into the UK in the hope to sell it there. But anyway, and we told them be careful, these poor. There was like a Gucci model or someone who was told, "Oh, just take these 2 suitcases, meet a guy in a coffee shop, it'll be fine." Somewhere in South London, and now it's doing 5 years or whatever. Anyway, can we talking about things that make you thin and make you fat? I did read a thing about this new strain of marijuana that actually makes you as an appetite suppressant, which is not commonly known about marijuana. Let's get back to can we raise JL's point? I do want to talk about this obesity thing. I remember, Ian, years ago, you and Humphrey and Harris did a whole thing about sort of the growth of obesity in the US, and we were always, it's always been incredible to me, coming to the US when I first came, in the very early 80s, just looking at the size of some of the people. I went to Disneyland and I went, oh my God, I can't believe some of the people I'm seeing. You didn't see that in Europe. Clearly, obesity has crept up everywhere. But I mean, the philosophy seems to be now that it's not to do with what you eat. It's not to do with, what they put in the food. It's not to do with self-discipline. It's not to do with a healthy lifestyle. It's purely, some people cannot switch off the sort of the desire to not eat anymore, and that's what essentially Wegovy and Ozempic do, right? Are they the same drug? I think Ozempic and Wegovy, I think, are the same drug, aren't they? But just marketed.
Same drug, same. Yeah.
But I mean,
semaglutide.
That's right. But I mean, other than the fact that these drugs cost a gazillion dollars, $1,000 a month, and we should apparently anybody who's either obese or going to be obese should be on them, which means 100 million plus Americans, and we would bankrupt us in the country. We did that for everybody. What's your sense, JL, about how this debate's going on in the medical circle? Is it kind of accepted? I even saw some interesting conversations about juvenile obesity and how we should be putting kids 10 and 12 years old on these drugs, potentially for life. What's your sense about, are they so affected the debate is done now, or do you think that there's a backlash to be coming from this?
Remember that I trained in a very traditional academic medical environment at Columbia. I trained there, went there for medical school. And I think, doctors are just programmed very much to think about, what does the evidence show? What are the clinical indications? What are the guidelines? So I think probably for most physicians and, maybe even for the endocrinologists who are on the cutting edge of this, I still think that this class of medication is really indicated for people who have, severe obesity, who are facing severe medical consequences as a result of their obesity and need to get this very expensive medication that is hard to get because you need prior authorization. So in the medical community, I would say we tend to probably be very conservative about how to prescribe this. But the point, we've made this before, there is what doctors want to do, and then there's what the public wants to do. And if the public knows that there's a drug that you can take that will magically make you lose 20% of your body weight, to help people shed kilo after kilo of weight, and it gets into the, to the public fascination that there's this magic drug out there, it quickly gets out of the hands of physicians. And as I was saying before, now you have all these digital health companies that are more than happy to prescribe the medication. So I still think the typical doctor would say exercise, weight loss, do the typical things that we would advise, but that may evolve over time, and you may see more doctors be more accepting of this medication.
But if you look at, so for instance, David Alba, who's a cardiologist, I think, follow on Twitter, has been talking a lot about this, and look at some of the obesity. There was that Puff piece on 60 Minutes, basically quasi-sponsored by Novo Nordisk, which didn't mention things like how much the drugs cost, but about how terrible it was that insurance companies were stopping people from getting to this drug. But if you say this is the solution, and I have a couple of friends who, I look at them and they're like me, and they've got a few pounds, and they probably should give up the curry and the beer and do a bit more working out. But one or two of them have been very successful on it and have dropped a lot of weight and working out and doing well, and they're clearly eating a whole lot less, right? And the alternative for them may have been, lap band surgery or probably not bariatric surgery, because they're kind of in that 30 to 35 BMI level. There's 120 million Americans who were kind of in that zone.
Sure.
Including looking in the mirror here. So if you're going to say, and we know it's worse in kids, right? It's worse in certain populations. If you're going to say we know this works, and we've decided obesity is not a matter of willpower, not a matter of what you eat. It's something you can't control. It really is a disease, and it has implications. Blah blah blah. Irrespective, I think, of whether or not people want to lose weight for a wedding or look better on the beach, you could argue that this is the medicalization of something that has been coming. And if you look at photos of Americans 50 years ago, it doesn't look like they look now. Right? It's clearly not the same. So I'm wondering if there's a good reason to not pursue this.
There's a great book by a guy named Michael Moss, Salt, Sugar, Fat, about the food industry, and he talks about how they've learned in the last 4 decades how to maximize the amount of those ingredients so that you hit your trigger point without putting too much in that it makes you sick. And he says, look at a graph. Around 1985, the graph for obesity just took off. He said, now, it's not that we all of a sudden lost our willpower in 1985. It's not that our genetics changed in 1985. It's that's when they really figured out how to manipulate us with how they constitute our food. And that is his belief about why obesity has been taking off, because the food giants are getting better and better at making us eat more high calorie stuff.
Yeah. And Matthew, you make the point of, 50 years ago, Americans, weren't as obese. So yes, I think Kim is right to some extent that, there's been engineering of our food that has led the population to get fatter and to get bigger. And look, if we're going to say that we can't escape that food engineering, if our lives are lived because we work so hard as Americans that we can't exercise then maybe we will have to capitulate and say that the only way to fight our obesity battle is with this new drug, which, by the way, to me is like the most American thing in the world, right? Like, we have this problem and, we're going to ignore the cause of the problem, and then we're just going to treat it with this other thing. And by the way, this is a medication that has all kinds of side effects. We don't know the long-term impact of being on a GLP-1 inhibit or agonist for many years. So once we have the side effects of that, we'll treat that. That's a very American thing. And, as somebody who was born abroad, but who is, embraced being an American and is proud to be an American, at some point I say, like, that's who we are. And that's the way, we could deal with it the way the Europeans deal with it, or we'll deal with it the way we deal with it as Americans.
So let me ask two questions. Like, what's your, and I looked at this a little bit, there's been some discussion about people who come off it regressing back to where they were and maybe worse. And this is somewhat similar for the people who go for the diabetes reversal, go to extreme keto and then give it up, and things get worse. And then the side effects, they're kind of like, you get nauseous and you have diarrhea, you have a bunch of unpleasant stuff. I don't know how bad they are. I guess the question is, how bad is it to go off it, and how many people will be driven off it by the side effects before we start talking about the minor issue of the fact it's $12,000 a year?
Yeah, we know what the short-term side effects are, and I think that this is an important distinction to make. So the nausea, vomiting, and for some people, apparently, those side effects are intolerable. So I think that you're going to see this short-term phenomenon. And then, we didn't realize that fen-phen would cause pulmonary hypertension and other things that had not shown up in clinical trials. So who knows what, the mass prescribing of this medication will show in 1, 3, 5, 10 years. And then the second thing, as you mentioned, who knows what it's like to come off this medication, and will people regress and be worse off than before they started? So that would lead somebody with my kind of training to say, probably only use this medication if it's your only option. But if you have other options, if you do not exercise now, initiate an exercise program. If you're not eating a healthy diet, initiate a healthy diet. At least give those things a try first. And Kim, I'll say, I'm a Doritos man. I'm not overweight. I weigh 180 pounds. But I know what you're talking about. I look at the Doritos, and it really is a drug, and my wife has to say, okay, we're only buying one bag because you can't stop eating these things. So I think you're right in terms of the engineering of the food.
Yeah. I just a couple of sort of funny stories of the 2 weeks ago when I was with all these CEOs, but one of the exercises that we did was kind of like a March Madness bracketology thing about health systems from different countries that they had a shtick, Asian people had a shtick about. And of course, the winner was the French, right? And America got beaten in the first round. This was sort of multi-parameter judgment of the value and performance of the health system. So I got up and I said, it was a perfect opportunity to bust out my old joke about, because I go to France every year and I've had exposure to the French health system. And the reason they come out number one has got nothing to do with their health system. It's actually pretty bloody scruffy, in my opinion, but apart from Matthew's good experience. But the reason the French do well is because they walk, they drink red wine, and they get naked in the summer. And nothing will keep your BMI down better than getting.
That's why they were banning the burkini on the beach, right? You all have to be naked on the beach so you can feel pain.
But the punchline was Raj Agrawal was in the meeting. I just had a meeting with him before we did this, and he was explaining his new thing, which is essentially what JL talked about. A kind of multimodal approach. Do the first stuff first, and then if that doesn't work, escalate to the drug or to bariatric surgery. So Raj sent me, it was the irony was he sent me a thing from the Times of London that day where the French have just declared a public health emergency because their obesity rate has doubled since 1997 up to 17%. Ours is 40%, for morbidly obese or whatever. JL nailed it. It's the perfect American solution. Take a pill or an injection.
It troubles me that I had no interest in weight loss drugs, but I can sing the theme song to Ozempic.
Yeah.
So I see those ads enough. And again, what are we? One of two countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer advertising for runs? It works. They do it because it works.
I can't
Yes.
understand why New Zealand allows it. It's just the other one that makes no sense.
Well, and you know, we're all glossing over the elephant in the room, which is the price. You know, I mean, the thing I don't quite get, and that puff piece in 60 Minutes was horrible that they didn't even raise the issue of it. The insurers are not paying for it, but why is if the market for this is gigantic, which it clearly is, why the hell are these guys not going after it as a relatively low-cost, ubiquitous solution if it's safe and efficacious? Now, I think JL's pointing to it might not be as safe and efficacious as once you start deploying it at massive scale. But it just seems to me a perfect example of the industry's gone down this rat hole of if it's a biological or a lot of molecules, it's got to be expensive. With no justification. And none of the policy interventions that we've done really get at the height of the launch price, which is really the causal factor behind drug spend.
I've been amused that I think we talked about this in a previous show. You know, so Lilly did the capping the insulin price, and other people are coming in now. But now it's turning out that the only reason that those companies are doing that is because their Medicaid rebates are in danger. So it's not out of the goodness of their hearts. It's just that they're going to lose money someplace else.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, perhaps the solution here is, you know, maybe, so you've seen the other thing that's gone on, and this is Gavin Newsom in California as well, right? He went to Civic RX and said, we're going to stop prepaying you to make insulin, right? Which is, that's the, is it Civic or Civica RX? It's the Civic, someone could Google it quickly. That's the hospital-owned
consortium
drug company, right? And they're going to start making insulin, and there's some discussion about Mark Cuban and cost plus drugs. Mark Cuban's cost plus market, cost plus drug, Mark Cuban, that thing, you know, again, also making insulin directly because it's
and joining forces with our friend at PBGH with EMSANA. You know, so that's that. Watch that one.
I mean, so seriously,
tangentially related to that.
So you've got, the problem is obviously you've got the patent protection on Ozempic and Wegovy, and then if they play the game that, you know, AbbVie's played, which they sure they will because they have good lawyers and they can afford them, that AbbVie's played with Humira, that patent protection doesn't last, you know, 17 years, or it lasts essentially forever because they keep messing with it, reformulating and getting these different qualifications for it. But I mean, it kind of is rearing down to, if obesity is the systemic problem. And there's a bunch of arguments. Is obesity really the problem, or, you know, can you be healthy and obese, and all this other stuff that, you know, that there are arguments going on. But if obesity is a societal problem, and Medicare or Medicaid end up paying for this stuff, perhaps there should be, you know, state or federal action to develop a cheaper version of these drugs. And by the way, this is the same argument, we didn't mention this at the start, but we just had yesterday in Congress, right? With Bernie Sanders talking to the CEO of Moderna, saying, okay, so we basically, the government, you know, gave you a whole bunch of research for free, and then paid for the development of this drug, and then bought it off you to guarantee you guys billionaire status. And now you want to quadruple the cost of the Moderna, of the vaccine for COVID. You know, you're kind of in that zone, which is that these drugs have these societal, I mean, potentially, we can discuss obesity, but certainly in the case of vaccinations, have massive societal benefits, and, you know, which essentially and in some cases are paid for by the, maybe not in the case of Ozempic, but have been paid for or funded by, you know, government research, and in some cases government contracting. So maybe that's the way it ends up. But in the end, I mean, you know, you can't introduce, I would say you can't. How do you introduce an $11,000-$12,000 a year product that a third of the population has to take? You know, that's right. Essentially nearly double healthcare spending. So
this is sort of a spotlight into our healthcare system generally. So obesity is a social problem, and we medicalized it, and we're fighting it with medical tools now and so on. But it's a public health problem, which we should be addressing through public health measures. Like, so why is it gone up? What are we doing that's causing that? What can we do at the ground level to try to avoid it, rather than how do we fix it once people are already obese? But we don't think that way. We slap Band-Aids on wounds after the wounds are opened.
Yeah. Although one thing I'd say, Matthew, is that there are very few drugs that you can look at that have a really dramatic impact on health, right? So if you were to look at, let's say, the statins might be one class of drug that have a dramatic impact on people, reduces cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. There are probably a couple of others, many of them that are now in generic phase, right? Like you can get a atorvastatin. I take atorvastatin now. You can get it for like your prescription for $2 a month or something like that. You could argue that Ozempic is really one of the few drugs that, by reducing people's body weight by 20%, could make the argument that this is a drug that pays for itself, right? That $11,000 is absolutely worth it on a population basis if you can get so many people to get out of this, obese state and into a more healthy state. So maybe there's going to be a different debate around this drug, because you can start doing the math and say, hey, this is not this is not Viagra, which provides some marginal benefit but doesn't really reduce healthcare costs. These drugs may actually be able to bend the healthcare cost curve, and it might be worth it to pay $11,000 per person per year because the drugs have a real clinical benefit.
I mean, that is an argument. There's a big argument there about whether how much obesity causes other stuff, right? And obviously it's very collinear, if not causal, with diabetes and heart conditions and whatever else. And yes, we spend a load of money on that stuff. I'm not sure we're spending an average 11,000 a year over 100 million people. I don't know how you get that math to work, but you can imagine if they can get the price of these drugs. As Ian said, it's a huge market, so it's not like one of these niche sub CKD things where the drug costs 60 grand a year for this, the 17 people who are on it. I mean, if you can get it, they must be able to find a way to make money if there are 100 million people who should be on it, even if it's tens of millions of people. So, but there's still an argument that you can be healthy and, at a higher weight, and it doesn't impact your health spending that much. So I haven't looked into this enough, and I don't look into it more, but you could argue that, yeah, if you're going to reduce diabetes significantly, reduce heart disease significantly, etc., and delay it, then it may be worth. There may be a big societal thing to be cracked here. But I mean, it reminds Kim. This reminds me. I know it's come out this week as well, right? There was another UN report on climate change that came out this week that basically said we're all screwed. And it's the same old story, right? We should be able to do something about this thing. We know the problem. There's enough scientific prevalence on it. It's the same thing with obesity and food, and what the kind of food we eat and all the rest of it, and then what the food business has done to tune the Doritos so the jail eats them all. In my case, it's the Safeway Select caramel ice cream with pretzels. 3 tubs, 2 tubs of that can go in no time. If you put it in front of me, there's no question.
The sales are about to take off, Matthew.
Yeah, well, I mean, at one point in the pandemic, they were saying 2 for 1. I was going to the grocery store going, I can't just buy one because it's like, what is free? It's every good drug dealer does that, right? Initially, but I mean, I had a brilliant point which I've now lost. So but you can't seem to fix these systemic problems, right? So this very week, right, when the climate change thing comes out, the Biden administration says, despite what we told you when we got elected, we're going to allow, because we think it will buy us some votes in Alaska. God knows why things will buy votes. We're going to allow drilling in Alaska for an oil well that will stop producing in 10 years' time. Which from my reading of the renewable energy price curve is that oil won't be sellable, but whatever, same thing. Can we really go back and fix agriculture? It seems to me we've tried some efforts to do healthier foods and talk about, salads and McDonald's and what have you, but the curve has surely gone towards more fat, more carbohydrates, more addictive foods. And it seems to me we have no way to fix these big societal problems. So maybe Jail's right. The only way to do it is to take Ozempic. And I read somewhere about a company that's extracting hydrocarbons from the air in order to make jet fuel. I don't know if they're going to be successful or not, but maybe the only answer is we can't stop putting this stuff out, but maybe we can take it out again once we put it in. I don't know.
I want to go back to Jail's point about how the digital health industry has gotten involved in this weight loss drugs, because the same thing has happened with the ADHD drugs, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
So is it something about digital health, or are they just, it's a problem of the healthcare system and digital health is just reflecting that? So I'm not quite clear whether they're just part of the problem or whether they are uniquely susceptible to the problem.
Well, I mean, I've got a point of view on this. I've interviewed, I'm blanking on her Nicole Kenyon is the CEO of Calibrate, which is one of the big companies that she actually was in another company, and she saw this as an opportunity and left to build a program around Ozempic. And there have been a lot of back and forth about whether they actually successfully could get you authorized for Ozempic and to stay on it, or Wegovy and to stay on it, or whether they only got some vouchers and you're only good for 6 months and had to leave it again, a bunch of customer service issues, and they raised a lot of money. Then they made some people off. I don't know how they're exactly doing. But what she said to me, which I thought was really interesting, was that employers were prepared to pay for this because for a certain class of people, and I think she meant, women aged 25 to 50, but, who knows who else, it actually, the fact that you could get them on this program meant they stayed in their jobs. And when there was such high, such high job turnover, and there was such low unemployment, especially, up to in the last few years, and then definitely during the pandemic, giving them this kind of giving enough of your employees this kind of reason to stay around was the reason they were able to grow so quickly, which I always was fascinating. Which does indicate that there are reasons you can build a business around that. Very similar to can you access ADHD drugs more easily, the way that Cerebral and DiME were doing it. And I don't know if that's a sustainable model, right? Because it's not really neither of them are sort of really a integrated medical model that we're looking after your whole self. And I think the other thing, I don't know about I don't know if you know more about the company that Weight Watchers bought, JL, but it seems to me that there was a lot of money, a lot of excitement around this, and there's been a kind of a backlash. Certainly definitely has been on the ADHD medication front. Those companies have basically all stopped doing that, and it's now almost impossible to get Adderall and its competitors. And it seems to me that's kind of happening as well on the Wegovy, the Ozempic front. I don't know, Joe, do you know more about the Weight Watchers acquisition?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the acquisition, but I did have a comment about what Kim's point about, what's the role of these digital health companies? Again, Kim, I cannot emphasize enough how much the training that we undergo as doctors impacts our willingness to prescribe, right? So all the things that we learn along the way, and then all the strictures that are placed on us, whether it's the DEA warning you every day, like, hey, you're going to go to jail, your state license, your state board saying, hey, we're watching you. So there's a lot of headwinds that prevent doctors from prescribing. Now, obviously, there are doctors who overprescribe benzos and opiates and all kinds of stuff. But if you were to think about physicians on a population basis, we are much more conservative about prescribing than the digital health entrepreneur who just shows up, who is not a physician, who has not been trained, who has not been scared, who has not been, who has not faced any of these kind of negative strictures that we have faced, and only sees upside to growing the ADHD market, or only sees how many people who are overweight who need to get this medication. And I think that's what's really happening. In almost all of those companies, they are not physician-founded companies. The doctors are just there, they're licensed donors, and they give up their license, and people write prescriptions, using the doctor's authority. But if you think about all of these people who are coming into the space, most of them have not gone through what we've gone through. And I think that's a result, that's why you see such aggressive behavior that ends up with backlash from the DEA, or ends up backlash from state medical boards, or whatever.
We're
all shouting at jail about that. Go on, Ian.
Well, no, a couple of critical points from JL's comments, which I think are really important. One is it's the shiny object is attracted to the addressable market, right? So it's a massive addressable market, but it's also, given that insurers are not paying for it, it fits into the cash on the barrel model that the HIMSS and the others have done. I mean, I'd be very curious to see whether HIMSS and Ro have any. I mean, what proportion of their sales are cash only versus insured? I suspect it's massively tilted to cash only. And if Ozempic and others remains you got to pay for it, then it's logical that there could be an explosion, because there's clearly a demand out there. There's a lot of more conservative doctors, as I understand it, in the community, who are just saying, no, I'm not going to prescribe it because you don't meet the criteria, you're not diabetic, blah, 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 for the valid reasons you mentioned. But then there's the whole Kardashian thing, you know, where everybody in Hollywood's on it, as you alluded to. So I could see how that. I mean, we did a lot of work, Matthew and I, over the years on how big is a consumer market. We kept coming up with like 7% of people will buy things with their own money, right? It's not a massive number that are going to lay out large numbers of dollars on, you know, on high ticket items. And you eventually run out of rich people and motivated people to do it. The question is, where do we go from there? But I'm fascinated that digital health is pivoting towards this drug. That's a really interesting.
But the problem is that $1,000 a month. I mean, you know, you're very quickly running out of rich people, right? Because that's even for, you know, wealthy people like JL, that's a real number pretty quickly.
Yeah,
right?
real money.
So you know, but if you can get it down to $200 a month, $300 a month, you know, if you get it down to a number that's you know, that's within the deductible, you know, for whatever. That's enough. I could see a real explosion there. I just don't know if the economics from, you know, was it Novo Nordisk wanted to do that. But to go back to something JL said, I agree with you, JL. Yes, doctors are not naturally conservative. There is backlash. We've seen it. On the other hand, you know, you've got to accept the fact that the people who went to Cerebral and Done and, you know, anywhere else online to get that medication, they thought they had a problem, that it wasn't being answered by the current healthcare system.
Sure.
And, you know, same thing is true. People who, you know, I don't like the answer to you're too fat being eat less ice cream and go running. You know, it's an unpleasant answer. I don't two things I don't want to do, you know, but
go skiing.
You know, but if that's what the healthcare system is telling me, and some other variation is saying, you know, it's okay. You can take this pill, you can do this, whatever. I understand why that's going to work, as you mentioned earlier. The problem is, you know, the issue I don't know, and I'm interested to find out, is where, you know, play this forward where you have a bit more experience with Ozempic and its competitors. What is the balance of opinion going to be amongst the typical medical professional? This is okay, or this is you really have to have diabetes, I'm not going to prescribe this, or is it going to be, oh, well, you know, it's more like general practitioners now prescribing, you know, SSRIs. Pretty much, you come into my office, you look a bit upset, I'll give you an antidepressant because it's the easiest thing to do. So I'm wondering how that will play out, and you know, I see a few of these doctors on Twitter being really aggressive about saying, you know, the mainstream doesn't understand how obesity works, and obesity is this essentially mental illness, and this drug will cure it. So I don't know. We'll see how it plays out. I did quickly we didn't get very far in our discussion about Medicare. Medicare Advantage. I did want to point out. You know, I'm still, when we're talking, just to switch topics. You know, a lot more fuss clearly is going to go on, and not just in Kim's commercials playing on Kim's TV in Cincinnati, but a lot more fuss, you know, and a lot less light about what is the real cost of, you know, what's going on within the world here. And one thing that I don't know if, and George Halbus has written about this a lot on the healthcare blog, is you know, the quality of care, especially for poorer people, you know, who tend to be poorer cities who tend to be going into Medicare Advantage, more wealthier ones. And there's a lot of discussion. I had a discussion with someone today who said, no, the Georgia's numbers are wrong. There are more foot amputations and there's worse care and lower quality care in Medicare Advantage. Whereas, you know, what George always says, oh no, there were more foot amputations in fee-for-service because there was no incentive for the plan. There is no plan like to reduce that by teaching people how to clean their feet and, you know, dry their socks and all that kind of stuff. Do we have a sense collectively if the argument about, you know, the sort of amorphous argument about does it cost more, does it cost less? Are we going to, you know, is risk adjusting going on? Is it being stopped? Is it going to be taken out? Is having any impact on the quality argument? This was always back in, when I learned this stuff, before I met you, Ian. And then Holt always told me that managed care plans had better quality measures and fee for service never did and was more expensive. We've had a lot of back and forth on Medicare Advantage since then, but does anyone have a sense about where that argument is now?
Well, I mean, if you read George's stuff, he basically is making the powerful case that Medicare Advantage is like a wonder drug. It saves money and it's improved quality, and there can't be upcoding because. But I, with all due respect to George, and I'm a big fan of his, I think there is evidence in the MedPAC stuff, and I think George is conditioned by the plans he's run, which are integrated delivery systems as well. And I can only tell you, my experience as a board member at MLK. I mean, we don't have a lot of Medicare in the community. We have nothing but managed Medicaid. And, our CEO describes it as Soviet medicine. I mean, they pretend to have a network of providers, and the providers pretend to take patients, but I've never seen them. And, so our number one admission at MLK medically is for untreated sepsis related to long-term diabetes. And our number one surgical admission is for amputation, because there's people in South Central LA have never seen a doctor in 40 years, and I've been basically living with untreated diabetes for a long time. So they're covered by covered California, not covered California by LA Care, the Medicaid one. I mean, they're theoretically enrolled by this plan that has the incentive to do all the things George is talking about, and yet doesn't. And so I think part of this is a battle over who has the moral high ground, and the plans, are defending themselves that they should have access to that funds flow because that's their profitable line of business.
Sure.
Which really speaks to where do they go if it gets cut? Because remember, this happened in the 90s. I mean, I was retained by Accenture then, and Accenture made a fortune going around helping health plans get out of Medicare Advantage if the AAPC rate wasn't high enough. They can leave. United can drop markets. I mean, they're not required to be everywhere necessarily.
Yeah, no, and I think it went down from it got up to 28-30%. It went down to what, 18, 16, the percentage of people, and now but since the Medicare Modernization Act and the rates got bumped up over 2004 onwards, it's gone from there to now over 50%. And I think we'll have to see what happens with the stuff that although it's probably not clear to the poor punter watching the commercial in Cincinnati, but the stuff they're complaining about, right, is the audits and the risk adjustment, retrenchment, and all the stuff that's going on. And we'll have to see how it pans out. I'm still just having now been lectured by the people by people at Avalier, the people the Richard Cronics of the world, the MedPACs of the world, the Red Berwick and Gilfillan stuff, and had read and rewritten George's stuff, all this. I have no idea what the real. It's like hospital accounting in the 1990s when we first got together. I have no idea what the real numbers are in any of this stuff. But yeah, it's clearly highly profitable, and to the point where they can pay brokers a ton of money, to switch people between plans. And so I wish that there was a valid source of truth somewhere in this, and as far as I can tell, there ain't.
Well, I mean, forget Medicare. My favorite example is, so Kaiser's been around for what, 80 years? If Kaiser was only 3%, 2% rate of growth smaller than other things, by now their cost would be a third of other plans, but they're not. So if they don't do what they say they do, does anybody know what they're doing?
All right, that's not a bad point to leave the discussion. Let's have a quick whip round and see what we are looking at in the coming up in the next week or so. Why don't I start with you, JL?
So we're just coming to, we talked about this, I think last time I was on, the DEA is proposed some rules that could impact how we use telemedicine.
I have put my comment in, and I'm not
all right.
the DEA, as you may imagine.
Fantastic. So that comment period is coming to an end. It'll be interesting to see what people had to say. I will follow that story close.
Your colleague in arms, Stephanie Pepstrong from I'm going to get the name of a company wrong now. It's not Brave Health. What's that? Bouldercare.
Okay.
Has put up some pretty strong web pages and told all our patients what was going to happen, and got some very interesting patient reaction. Not sure how much the DA gives up rat's ass about patients, but that's a separate issue. But certainly a big topic we'll be hearing more about soon. Ian.
Well, I'm still watching First Republic. I mentioned last week.
You didn't get your money out yet?
No. Well, I just wrote the check to. I paid my taxes, so I'm now. You're hoping. Getting my money out, but I'm giving it to the government, so I don't know.
Well, I mean, the government will probably come and take it either way.
Yeah.
My understanding.
So I'm waiting to be taken over now. That would be the ultimate irony, that my check to the IRS bounces because First Republic goes under. So that's what I'm worried about this week.
Kim.
So today is the 11th anniversary of the signing of ACA.
Oh, and
it's hard to believe now that all the things that ACA did and are now taken for granted, and what as Biden said, what a big fucking deal it was when it happened, but we're taking it for granted, and despite it, we still have all these problems. 30 million uninsured, half of people living in rural America don't have access to OB-GYN care. So, oh God, it's just distressing to think about how much worse things could be and how much better they should be.
Well, that's dead true. Actually, there were 2 points. One is Meryl Guzner wrote an interesting piece saying, actually, if you look at the rate of increase of healthcare costs, it's been relatively stable over the, we're stable with GDP over the last decade. There was a bit of a bump up during the pandemic, but and maybe when Obama said if you pass this, it'll save you $2,000 each, compared to what it would have been, maybe he's right. The other thing I thought was that, did you notice who was in the Oval Office? I don't know if you're Ted Lasso fans, but Roy fucking Kent in the Oval Office with Joe Biden, the guy who's based on Roy Keane and in the Ted Lasso series, who swears all the time. And I wonder if he and Biden had a conversation with the F word in it. I don't know if they were released.
Who explained to Joe who Ted Lasso is?
That's all right. Well, with that, we have come to the end of another great hour of conversation on the healthcare blog. This was THCB Gang for March 23rd, 2023. My video is still going crazy here. It's not going crazy. You were listening to Ian Morrison from Menlo Park, California, Kim Bellard from Cincinnati, and John-Luke Neptune from the soon-to-be prison island overrun by MAGA mob protesting against the arrest of their dear cult leader, Donald Trump of Manhattan. This is Matthew Holt saying thank you very much for watching, listening on the podcast, and we will see you next week, where hopefully I will get Jen Goldsack from DiME and a few other people, a few other different people on it. We need a higher quality of fewer Y chromosomes and more X chromosomes on the show. And a quick word for those of you who've been following our friend Casey Quinlan. The news ain't great. She is, for you may have heard, heading into hospice. I'll try and get you an update on what's going on with her over the next week or so. But our hearts and our minds and our love go to Casey. And with that, we will see you next week. Thank you very, very much for watching and listening.